90 years ago, Stalin orchestrated a famine that killed millions of Ukrainians. And I think we're supposed to light a candle, but we'll do that at the end. I'm here with my cousin, Andrea Zoltanetzky, and I am talking to you from my living room in Washington, D.C. Where are you?
I'm in my home office in Berlin, Germany.
So I want to start by talking about some photos. There's a great picture of us together when we're, about 4 or 5 in Brooklyn?
Five, yes. I remember I was showing off my kindergarten backpack.
The people missing from that photo are our grandmas. We both grew up with our grandmothers, which I think is kind of cool. We grew up living with them. My grandma left Ukraine in 1928, which was just when collectivization was starting. And she was very lucky leaving at that time. But she left behind her sisters and a brother, and they experienced the Holodomor, the famine of 1932-33. But your grandma was there for it.
She grew up in a small town, a small village in Western Ukraine. And she only went to the first and second grades. After that, she started working in the fields. When she became a teenager, that's when the big famine started. And the food that they grew, the government started taking it away from them. She both had to do some things, unspeakable things. I mean, eating bark off of trees to survive, as well as seeing some pretty horrific things. And later in the famine, towards the end, her father, who had been living in New York, came to see her, and she had the chance to leave Ukraine and go with him to New York, but unfortunately leaving her mother and brother behind.
This is where we could pick up the story with my grandmother, who was the first cousin of your grandmother's father. So when they actually came back with your grandma from Ukraine, they moved in with my grandma. She had just had my mom about, I think, a year earlier. My mom was born in 32, and they moved in together in East New York, Brooklyn, and lived together for 6 months. My grandmother, she lived through the famine that happened right after the revolution. It shaped her attitudes a lot, I think, towards food. And I remember her always going, she had a very thick accent, like, eat, 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 darling, eat. And she was always making wonderful food, vareniki, borscht.
Well, my grandmother was similar. I mean, with the wanting to feed everyone. She had this joke when I was a teenager. I would decline having something more to eat after having one portion. She would say, well, do you, are you not eating because you're watching your figure? And I would say, oh, yeah. Yes, that's why. And she would say, okay, fine, I'll watch your figure. You can continue eating.
I love that.
I think other than with your grandmother, who understood what her experience and believed her experience, I know that early on, when she was trying to tell other people about what had happened to her in Ukraine, other people didn't believe her. With my father and his sister, my aunt, she didn't tell them about it until they were older, till they were adults. And even when she told us, it was really hard for her. There were some times that she wanted to talk about it, but she would, even after all these years, she would start crying.
Some of the earliest stories that I heard about the famine were stories that I think your grandmother had shared with my grandmother and later my mom. And part of the reason I wrote The Lost Year was I heard this story from her about how quiet it was in wintertime in the village because people were starving and they had eaten all the animals, even the dogs and cats and horses. And there was this eerie silence. And I remember hearing that as quite a young person, and just being chilled by it and being like, why don't people know about this? How do you think the Holodomor shaped your grandma as a person? Particularly once she got to the US.
She was 19. So she was very young. And it was quite, I think it was quite a cultural shock. You know, I never really got the sense from her that she felt entirely comfortable in the US. I think her heart was always still there, even though she enjoyed, you know, her life in New York.
We've talked a lot just as cousins about intergenerational trauma and how these kind of events can shape the generations that come after. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts about that.
It was particularly hard. I mean, as my grandmother couldn't really talk about the famine, and because there wasn't a lot of awareness, she never really had a chance to mourn what had happened, and we didn't have a chance with her to mourn along with her for what she had lost. For me personally, I feel very comfortable being around a lot of food. I became a food photographer, and there's something really that, I mean, not only about, you know, just getting nutrition so that you can live, but there's so much about the social and emotional connections when you're sharing a meal with people, with your friends and loved ones, that, I mean, it's really sad to imagine that, you know, that Ukrainians weren't having that you know, emotional social connection.
I had never connected, even though I know you're a food photographer, your kind of like interest in you know, the artistic kind of presentation of food with this whole issue of food and how it's shaped your family history. But there is a through line there, which is really interesting. So your grandma lived to 106. And like, I know people may not believe that, but like, we have some photos of her even in her very late 90s, like kind of, you know, being with her grandchildren, great grandchildren. She was incredible. And I think it's really important to remember that people are more than just victims when you commemorate them, and that they have their own kind of personalities and quirks. And so I was wondering if you could just tell us what you remember about her as a person.
She loved taking care of kids, and she spent a lot of time with me and my brother and my cousins while we were growing up. And also, you know, the picture that I'm sharing here is she was 99 years old, and she just loved still like having fun and joking around and taking care of her, you know, her great grandkids.
So interesting what you said about her feeling a little bit like she didn't have as much of a voice to, you know, to assert herself because this story had been shut down. And, you know, that was sort of my experience. A lot of the immigrant community that we came from is that people were really timid, particularly because we came from a peasant background, and there was a real fear of people in authority. I think my grandmother, like, there's this video that's so cool that my dad did after I was born, where he asked her what she wants from me.
Not to be afraid of anybody?
She talks about like sort of the freedom from fear. And I think that sounds like your grandma.
Powerful.
Yeah, it was really powerful. But I bet your grandma is somebody who was there in 32, 33. I mean, I imagine that also shaped her and how she sort of interacted with the world.
You know, you just keep your head down. You don't want to make any waves. You keep to yourself. You have your circle of friends and your family, and you're not going to really rock the boat. I mean, I think you can tell it in her name, you know, her Ukrainian, your grandmother would call her Nastya. And I mean, she had a different name in America that was, you know, that was more, you know, Nettie, which was more, you know, sounded more American.
And there's a lot of guilt too, I think, that comes with the people who left relatives behind, like our families, because we still have relatives that we are in touch with now, both of us in current day Ukraine. And that just shows how strong these bonds are. Because, you know, my grandmother kept in touch with her family for 70 years through letters. And I know, you know, that was the last century, the war, you know, communism, all these things were incredibly, you know, difficult, I think, for the people who got out to watch from abroad.
The letters that she received from Ukraine, I mean, they were really like, you know, she looked forward to those letters, and you really can't imagine not being able to pick up the phone and call people or FaceTime people. Once she moved, she unfortunately didn't get a chance to go back to Ukraine.
What do you think she would want in terms of, now that we're talking about Holodomor and we're trying to kind of, bring attention and commemoration, what do you think she would want people to know?
I think people knowing about the horrible things that the Ukrainians had to go through. Her fellow villagers, she watched people that were half dead being buried alive. She would want people to know about that, and especially that people help what the Ukrainians are going through now.
And it's a really important piece of historical context for, Ukrainians feeling like that their lives during Holodomor were taken away, but so were their stories. And that's something that I think is really an important chapter of history that gives context to why they're kind of fighting so hard today. So I think we should light our candles. What do you think?
Yes. All right, let's do it.
It's very funny that we actually just on our own got the same candle. Kind of a mind meld. There we go. Okay.
All right, the twin candles.
This is our memorial. It's very meaningful. And I'm thinking of your grandma, and she was always so sweet and loving to me. After my Baba died, my grandma, she was like a mother to my mom. So very special person. And
yes, she was. You were very special to her and your mother as well.
so it's wonderful to honor her memory and the memory of all the victims and survivors of Holodomor.
Well, thank you for writing your book.
Well, thank you for sharing your stories.